As though we'd just come into a sanctuary and we were experiencing the obscurity prior to our eyes adjusting when we could explore the frescoes on the inside of the place. So here we're reading the title of the first lecture in GA 55 or 55 from the collected works or the Gesamtausgabe of Heidegger, 1943, der Anfang des abendländischen Denkens, Heraklit. So this is about Heraclitus, but it's about so let's see in the first paragraph why we're dealing with Heraclitus here. We have the translation der Anfang des abendländischen Denkens Heraklitus. The philologists and Capobianco also goes along with this. Lawrence Hemming likes the word Inception. But Anfang could as well be given without the, the peculiar elegance in the style of the classical scholars, simply as beginning. Anfang is an ordinary German word, which means beginning. The inception or beginning of the Occidental or Western thinking. The official translators of GA 55 give Occidental for abendländischen. They also say thinking, but it could be Western thought. We could also say origin. We could say, so there's this question of, if you follow sort of the simplest but nonetheless sensible rule of translation that Benjamin Jowett used to give, you say, once whoever has a sense of the thinker they're translating, in his case it was often enough Plato, then after reading an entire text will say what a sentence means, rather than the student manner of doing it, which would be to consult their grammar at every step and to make a word-for-word translation. With Heidegger, we have other difficulties, which is that the very question of the same questions that were recently came to the fore in the Trump versus Barbara case over, which is like, I looked at like the first 80 pages of it. It's like 180 pages or something. There were numerous different versions of so-called originalism in play. So, for instance, that the Supreme Court tries to take the original public meaning of constitutional clauses and phrases as the standard, or that they take, I think Alito's way of doing it is called textualism, where he tries to take the original meaning of the text. But this was, I I read Samuel Moyn posted something that was criticism of this done by a scholar who was especially focused on the different forms of originalism, and who said Alito was unable to really keep up with this. And in one absurd moment of Alito's decision, this writer brought out that Alito gave an interpretation which, however, failed the public meaning part, which I'm not sure actually if that was a critique of Alito himself, or is it just to say there's something that Alito said this is probably what the meaning is in terms of a term of art of the lawyers at the time. I think it had to do with domicile, what a domicile is, and apparently domicile doesn't mean just place of living, but it meant in the lawyers' technical terms of the time, it implied an intent to remain in a place. But there was this question whether this had been duly promulgated to the population. I mean, that one could always, in order to be a smart aleck, cite the notion that ignorance of the law is no excuse, is not rational in every case, because sometimes the law is very complicated and one can't reasonably be expected to understand it. And today, that's totally true, because there's thousands of pages. I mean, even just this decision is so long. Even people like myself who are to take some interest in understanding these things, it's too long to commit to with many of these decisions coming out, because there's other ones. There's like two other big ones at the same time. But I mean, if you look at the controversy over that, and then Roberts himself has doesn't subscribe to originalism, and the left-leaning justices have other ideas, and so on. The questions of how to read texts has a way larger application than basic thinking, but here we get actually in this paragraph some sense of how Heidegger's operating, but ultimately he's operating by saying that the best philological readings only give you a correct reading, which would be something like the type of readings that the originalists are trying to get through their various modes, through what was the intention of this man when he wrote the law originally, what was the original public understanding of it, and what does the text give us when we use it in tandem with I don't know if there's when the first Webster's dictionary is, but with some kind of lexicons of the 18th century that the framers of the Constitution would have that would explicate their use. So they would have all these funny things like Hawthorne inventing a bunch of words and things like that, and then they get in the dictionary according to the way certain authors that are prestigious, their language, and although they're personal inventions. I think the biggest simple rule with Heidegger, if you can apply a rule to Heidegger, is that the standard way of reading text is to make a forensic case, which is to say only to make a very strong case out of the evidence as it stands before us, as something dead before us, and then to show through usage. This is what this meant. To show many examples. Said this is a semantic field, and I like the example of the Homeric Nepios by I forget the name of the Edmonds. I think it is Susan Edmonds. This little paper on how she proves that there was an error in the standard understanding of this term in the ancient literature. That's just for people that want to go further into that. But that's the classical philologist go-to way of is to say, oh, that we're making a forensic case, a case about something that's already over and done with. Whereas Heidegger can't, and that would be the correct, and then if you did that in the best way, that would be the correct version. But Heidegger is bringing out phenomenologically that correct version, that dead version, doesn't exist. It exists in a way as just as things in the museum continue to exist, but it's a museumification, or it's not the what he's calling here the Argeschicht or eigentlich, or the very act of our history. So let's go into the first. So there's a tension between the claim that one can merely read out of the text and the claim that it's always wrong to read into text, and then this Heidegger's manner of reading text, which has to do with the very claims he's making as a thinker. Okay, let's look at the first lines here. Logik, Heraklits, Lehre, no, that's not what I want. Where's the first sentence? Heraklits Vorbetrachtung die Philosophie als das eigentliche Denken des zu Denkenden. So that's the first, that's the header. That's sort of the restatement of it. Philosophy as the eigentliche true, thinking, that which is controversially translated as authentic and mocked by Adorno. But let's say it this way. Let's give two versions here. Philosophy, there's sort of like an official version of the translation of this text into English of GA55, but let's give some other versions. Philosophy is true thinking of that which is to be thought. So we have an objective genitive form here. So it's like it's trying to, and it shows, so des is Denken, and then the action is on the side of the eigentliche Denken, which is des zu Denkenden, and then there's something to be thought. But you see at the course of this paragraph, Heidegger is fighting with the fact that grammar is limiting us, because grammar is telling us what's acting and what's being acted upon. So it's a who-whom problem. And he's trying to instead he's trying to stay with what's happening, but he's using grammar in his sentences because he must to be intelligible, but at the same time he's trying to introduce this notion of the amity of the thinkers in thought, which is as we'll get to well, let me skip ahead just to give that phrase in Greek. He's trying to get to this Greek notion, or what's in the Greek under the philiaton sophu, the amity. I'm pronouncing it again. Amity, or friendship with that which is to be thought, or the amity with that which is to be thought. And we're dealing with here the question of what it is to think for oneself, in connection with the notion of, if we were speaking in Kantian terms, we could talk about the inner as against the outer, or against the heteronomy, the pressure from society, as it were. The Gwen Stefani line that's it's so messed up the way society all thinks. Quoting something that everyone all thinks. I mean, everyone thinks it's so messed up the way society all thinks, right? Which is kind of what makes the line amusing. But we're dealing with, okay, so there's autonomy as against heteronomy, but then Heidegger used all the time Eigenlichkeit as against das Man. But here we have specific examples of it with respect to the origin of what is called the abendländische philosophy, but at the same time he's saying this is redundant because philosophy is only the thing that had this one special origin. Just formally we could say, but well, look at the mistake. It's sort of interesting to look at the mistake that people make when they say, "Oh, but don't the Hindus have philosophy?" Obviously, they do. Blah blah blah. But notice how this takes for granted that philosophy is sort of something everybody must think in the terms of, and therefore, mustn't it be that the Indians also have philosophy? So it actually gives philosophy more power than the people that are supposedly due to their prejudice, towards their group, their chauvinism. That's the right word. Heidegger, due to being a chauvinist of the West, insists that only the West has philosophy. But the people that say India has philosophy are even worse, because they take philosophy for granted, which actually originated amongst the Greeks, as the word shows, and then they say, look, everyone, the Chinese and the Indians must also have this. I mean, just ignoring that there was the actual origin, it actually means something. One could also say, formally, whatever the Hindus do, they called it something, and that's what it is. And it involves especially dharma or karma, karmic thinking, and it involves our dhyanic thinking, and it involves not physis or nature, but rather there's cycles of dharma and so on, of the coming forth according to the three main Hindu gods and so on. It's a totally different thing. So if we subsume it under philosophy, that's the actual chauvinism under the, but just notice how it's done under the guise of the cultural pluralism. But it's actually even worse than the ones that are aware of what they're doing. And then point out, or not even worse, but it's just bad where what Heidegger's doing isn't bad. It's just saying what happened. And then Heidegger's saying, even though we're using this term, Western philosophy or abendländische philosophy, it's in a way it's redundant, because there's only this one origin, beginning, or as the classical scholars like to say, inception of philosophy. And the inception, as Lawrence Hemming clarifies, is still ongoing. It happened at one time, but it's still with us. It's still the inception, because we still, just as those thoughtless people that say the Indians also have philosophy, the Chinese also have philosophy, insist the thought of it is so strong and it's still with us that they apply it like that, as though it were always to be thought by all human beings, as though it was co-equal with being a human being. Okay, so let's look at this first paragraph in more detail, paying attention to some of this, how we can sort of get more with the translation. If you read Dostoevsky or whatever, and you read the Constant Garnet translation, you read the Richard and Maria Pever translation, which is more word for word, you see different things. But the fun thing about that is, in a way, that because if we're not Russian speakers, then we're getting something extra by the fact that we have to translate it. Ancient Greek is also somewhat different than modern Greek, so the modern Greek speaker can also get something extra, I think. But even if we were reading a text that's in our own native language, like the Constitution, we could see not just see what's commonly put down as linguistic drift, arranging everything in such a vast way that you need 180 pages to clarify what you're doing on these cases. And then there's like absolutely no agreement between the tribes. There's this mad tribalism of what counts as a sensible, of when is this guy just cheating and being quote unquote arbitrary, and when is he treating the text reasonably. I mean, this is part of the reason why philologists are much more pugnacious than analytic philosophers, because analytic philosophers make up rules of clarity amongst themselves. Then they cordon themselves off from the madding crowd, and then they're able to speak in the same language. And so it gives the superficial appearance of a professional seriousness of discussion. And also it gives the superficial impression that they're smart because they understand the usage among people in rooms in Oxbridge, around Trinity College, Cambridge, and so on. There's artificial ways, and so that's also, I guess, it's part of the reason why the 1,000 years of the medieval philosophy has sort of been put down and thrown away in a way as merely scholastic and dogmatic, because to some extent they had, just as today the analytic philosophers are mostly scorned and regarded as fake philosophy basically in the sense that if somebody teaches creative writing, they assume that they know what creation is, what it is to be creative. They turn it into a routine, and they assume that they could teach it every year to the students. The same thing happened with medieval logic. It became just the kind of this cheap stock panoply of so-called fallacies, which any imbecile could apply readily, and which, even though they didn't really fit the case and didn't really make sense, and then use as a sort of a cudgel in order to inoculate themselves against thinking. Syllogistic logic sort of died for that reason. It's not being taught in the universities because the people that used it spontaneously and naturally as part of what they were doing and knew how to use it properly, and didn't use it just to be capacious and just to score points, like the people who took it over, like the Brights or whatever, just to annoy people like Steven Pinker and tire them out. Tire out those people that would then be put on the back foot because they have to explain why syllogistic logic, it doesn't really make sense when it's used that way. Okay, so let's get to the text itself, as it were. Reading text is always useless because nobody understands them, but nonetheless we get some sort of chance, as it were, to enter into the thinking. Maybe we're lucky, but probably not. All right, so the inception, beginning of Occidental Western thinking, Logik, Heraklits, Lehre von Logos, Logic. All right, where are we? Anfang, don't worry, I'll translate this. Von Anfang des abendländischen Denkens, on the origins of, in scare quotes, Western thought or thinking. The official translation, they prefer always to translate thinking and make it into an activity. Let's see. Philosophy is a very active thinking about what is to be thought. All right, so let's enter into the first paragraph. Die Vorlesung handelt vom Anfang des abendländischen Denkens. This lecture deals with the beginning of Western thought. So I think in the official one they say Occidental thinking. The lecture deals with the inception of Occidental thinking, so I'm saying the lecture deals with the beginning of Western thought. The word, in scare quotes, thinking here refers to the thinking of the thinkers. Das Wort denken meint hier das Denken der Denker. I guess I could also say to the thought of the thinkers. Since ancient times, this kind of thinking has been called, quote-unquote, philosophy. Von elders, the elders. Von elders here nennt man dieses Denken Philosophy. So long sentence where Heidegger then sort of reverses the sense that the philosophers are sort of the actors thinking the thought. Das philosophische Denken ist wohl das eigentliche Denken und what does it say here? Deshalb fiel ihnen das einige gedacht wird, was seinem Wesen nach das zu Denkende ist, indem es für sich das Denken in dem Anspruch nimmt. Philosophical thinking is in fact a true or eigentliche thought. So this is sort of like this eigentliche true, or another way to put that is the very act of thought. We're talking about the very act of thought rather than somebody just talking about thought. Or that's what we're trying to talk about, is the very act of thought. Precisely because it thinks. That which is by the very nature is the object of thought, in that it claims thought for itself. You have here sort of a question of one, sort of what is it to think for yourself? And the thinking for yourself turns out to be not about you as whatever your name is, and then like, oh, what's your view on this? But it turns out somewhere between, somewhere in this amity that the thinkers have for thought, the thought is also thinking for itself. And Heidegger is trying to work out a way to see, if we could enter into this thinking, which is that which once its thought is still in the ongoing and deciding the future, still the future, in the same sense, in a way. It's a weak example, but in the same way that people that say the Hindus have philosophy and the Chinese have philosophy, which in a way is perfectly sensible, because Indians have studied Western philosophy, and same with Chinese and the Japanese Kyoto school and so on. But in another way, it's wrong, because that's not sort of, if you look at the way India absorbs things, if you go to the Kak Mountains, or to go to various areas of India where people definitely think in a way that's different than the people who say everyone has their philosophy or everyone has their religion. Trying to sort this out is difficult, and it's something Heidegger's very good at. Another example we'll get to later on, but not today, is that religion, Heidegger says here in this lecture, is primarily a Roman thing, because of course it comes from religio, which then there's a contest between Cicero and the Catholics over what the origin of the word is, whether it means sort of a primordial piety, or whether it rather means what's commonly said in the etymology of the thing that binds. But Heidegger's point here is that there's a lot of mistakes have been made including by Nietzsche, in reading Heraclitus as talking about the gods, or theoús, by linking them to religious or to theological interpretations. There's theology already in Plato and Aristotle, but only because they develop it. And then you see that in the Euthyphro, for instance, where all the gods are then transformed into one god, and then get put on this theological footing in the Politeia and the interpretation of Agathon, which is then taken over by the Catholics, of course, later on. So Heidegger says often, like the early Greeks in this first so-called Inception, they don't yet have religion. But likewise, other peoples early on didn't have philosophy. but the philosophy has its origins out of this time that he's trying to look into. Philosophical thought is in fact true thought precisely because it thinks that which by its very nature is the object of thought, and that it claims thought for itself. Okay, so there's a lot of difficult things in the first beginning of this, which won't become that much clearer by reading the whole thing, but then we'll get certain ideas. I don't really aim at making it clear because what's actually active with us, like what we actually are, isn't necessarily clear to us, or it isn't clear to us. Actually, it's obviously not clear to us. It's more of a mystery. Many things are mysteries that we don't. Beauty, for instance, is one of the most brutal mysteries, enigmas, and that's sort of obvious. But on the other hand, we could pass that off and say, "Oh, now here's some poetic talk about beauty and how mysterious it is," or we could say, "Here's some non-scientific talk about something which, of course, could be given in terms of." Showing how AI can produce on. I'm following some accounts on Instagram which seem to me probably to be AI generated, but they know through scientific means, sort of rather than kind of Hollywood means of showing people movies and seeing how the audience reacts, but they know through scientific means in advance this, what they call symmetry. I mean, what they call symmetry isn't actual symmetry, because almost every face is kind of is the same on the right and the left side, more or less. Symmetry is some kind of term of art, but they know through, that's the way people like to talk about it. For, I don't know, it seems like it must be 30 years that people have been talking about the science of symmetry as being the science of beauty, and therefore that just as with vision being turned into the color spectrum, you could speak of beauty as being transformed into this models, into this algorithmic models. The problem being for the longest time that while it could work sometimes with still photographs, it usually in real life what's the still photograph doesn't translate to what's actually attractive to people. Because when you have actual interactions with people, it's different. But it seems like with the AI, with the way they're getting little short motion capture things, or whatever they should be called, videos, it gets more and more where you can't quite, at least to me, I can't tell the difference. Maybe somebody would say younger people could tell the difference better. I don't know. Let's look more, but I mean that just is an example of that actually sort of what's happens in daily life. It only gets a false clarity most of the time, and clarity isn't probably not something we even really want. It's not that helpful. What's more helpful is being able to sort of get a sense or a feel of how the thing Stimmung of how it is, and that's sort of what we're trying to do with reading this text. Although we have all these sort of clarifactory, quasi-clarifactory, pseudo-clarifactory statements surrounding it in a way, almost like sophists, almost like the mystery. That's another one, the mystery of why is sophistry always collect around the great thinkers? Why does the literature on the great thinkers always collect around them? This being literature through a podcast on Heidegger, what do they always collect around it? Is it only because I want to be able to say that I've said here's the rare bird Heidegger, and now I've said something about him, so therefore I'm important? So let's go further. Das denkerische Denken ist das wesentliche Denken. Reflective thinking is essential thinking. Philosophical thinking is indeed the authentic thinking, and precisely for this reason, because in it that which in its essence is the to be thought is thought, and that it claims thinking for itself. Thoughtful thinking or reflective thinking is essential thinking. Der autonome Philosophie stammt aus dem Umkreis des Anfangs des abendländischen Denkens. The ancient term philosophy originates from the early days of Western thought. Grecian gedacht bedeutet Philia tun, so für die Freundschaft für das zu denken. In Greek it means philia for sophun, amity with that which is to be thought. So the first thinkers claim to have this amity or friendship with that which is to be thought, and so let's end it by this as we start to go into this text on featuring Heraclitus, who Heidegger says is one of the three thinkers at the origin of Western thought, which is also the origin of Western technology, clarifying that Western thought or Western philosophy is philosophy, and that technology also, we say to clarify that it's Western technology, but there's the only technology is Western technology. So Aristotle says of this philia that it would be better in a political community to have amity than it would to have justice, or that you could look at it in the politics. Probably the two most important books for understanding the American Constitution are Aristotle's Politics and Montesquieu's The Laws. And he says the lawmaker should, when making the law that's aiming at justice, should try to get as close to the situation of amity, which is a situation where you don't need justice. Heidegger is talking about, and this is the word is philia, which is connected to word affiliation, although maybe it doesn't mean the same thing at all anymore. Linguistic drift, but the word's related. And I'll end it just with this sort of provocation. I don't even know if this is true, but I think when Justice Roberts uses the notion of structuralism as his guide, he's basically making an amity or philia argument, which is he's saying the way to understand politics is to understand what would it be like if you had this amity of the whole, and then when SCOTUS interprets the case, it has to think about it that way. It has to think about the whole. It has to think about the amity of the whole in thinking about how it interprets what the law is. James Wilson has used this phrase, what the law is, but he doesn't mean it in the current acceptation. It means rather in the mind of God. There's a law, and then it's sort of like through the working the law appear. What he means is not the interested actions of a lawyer as is of a justice interpreting the law or construing a clause in the Constitution, but rather what the law is, which is to say according to reason. And according to reason means you could say at the same time as it is for God rather than as it is for an interested person. So again, so I'll just end it by saying again, there's these cases that are flowing forth constantly out of Montesquieu. They point back to Aristotle's Politics, and Aristotle is already, according to Heidegger, at this time when there's this hardening and congealing of this so-called first inception, as the classical scholars like to put it, or the first beginning, the first origin of philosophy or thinking. And then here we're, remember, one of the issues we're dealing with is the way grammar kind of pushes us around. I'll just remember this one thing. It's like, yeah, it's sort of a distraction, but I just say it for, I don't know, somehow for redundancies or something, like to get it, but to be more thorough. There's people who study the way grammar links up with behavior, and you could show on a large scales the way grammar and behavior are active in the long run and in large populations. But again, this isn't really that shows the danger. There's a sort of a danger in treating Heidegger when you don't go towards really what Heidegger's trying to show. You can make Heidegger also into a technology, into some fodder for an algorithm.